After a year of using the iPhone 16 Pro Max, I realized that Apple may never make a phone like this again. So here's my long-term review of the iPhone 16 Pro Max to see if it's really still worth buying. Starting with the design, it might look a bit familiar. And if you're thinking what I'm thinking, then yes, this phone from the outside looks almost exactly the same as the iPhone 15 Pro Max, albeit for a few minute different changes. First of all, it's a bit bigger. Apple increased the size of the phone from 6.7 inches on the 15 Pro Max to 6.9 inches on the 16. And you do notice that larger frame slightly when holding the phone side by side compared to the 15 Pro Max. Another thing you might notice is that the titanium frame on the 16 Pro Max is not brushed, but instead a more smoothed down finish that feels a lot nicer to hold in the hand. But one thing I did notice is that it does fingerprint a lot more compared to the 15 Pro Max, but not as bad as stainless steel. And on the back, we still have that really nice soft touch matte finish, which I still personally really like. And the last new change Apple did with the design of this phone is they added another button, the camera control button. And honestly, in my personal opinion, I don't think this button is as useful as the action button was, which was introduced on the 15 Pro Max. But I do have to admit that I do frequently use it to launch the camera. Knowing that it's just there, it's kind of become second nature. Though I've never really used the swipe gestures of the actual button itself, having the button there, I'd say, isn't necessarily a bad thing and can come in handy, especially if your action button is linked to something else, like mine was. So yeah, when it comes to the design of the 16 Pro Max, this is definitely the pinnacle of this specific metal and glass sandwich design. As we've seen on newer iPhone models, Apple is moving away from that. And don't get me wrong, I really learned to appreciate the way the new iPhone 17 Pros look, but really looking at the 16 Pro Max again, it just reminded me how elegant and premium the previous design we had on the iPhone was. Though of course it was getting a bit stale, definitely looking back now, I've learned to appreciate this design even more. The screen on the iPhone 16 Pro Max still remains great, top-notch and top-tier in almost all aspects. And Apple did change a few things compared to the 15 Pro Max. But first, the things that stayed the same. Starting with the brightness, it still goes up to 2000 nits, which is great for outdoors, especially when the sun hits the phone. Another thing that remains the same is 120 Hz. It still remains fast and fluid. So what Apple actually changed with the display of this phone actually comes down to two things. First, the brightness. On previous iPhones, brightness couldn't go down as much, but now on the 16 Pro Max, it can go as low as 1 nit. Meaning if you're using your phone in a dark room, it shouldn't scorch your eyes. Though it probably isn't the best to use your phone in the dark. If you're someone who's up to that or does that frequently, then having that lower nits brightness on the 16 Pro Max should help out a lot. The second change that came with the 16 Pro Max actually is the size. And the size of the screen is now at 6.9 inches compared to 6.7 on the 15 Pro Max. And one thing Apple did that I actually really appreciated and was one of the reasons why I actually upgraded to this phone back when it first came out. Though it might sound minor, it's actually the bezels. So on this phone, the bezels were significantly reduced. When the 15 Pro Max came out, I thought the bezels were already quite thin. Then when Apple announced that not only was the screen getting bigger, but the bezels were actually getting thinner, it really made the phone look so much more modern and futuristic. So when it comes to the screen, the foundationals remain. Everything about this screen screams flagship phone. And Apple just adjusted a few things to make it even better. And even when compared to the screens on today's flagship phones, the iPhone 16 Pro Max definitely puts up a good fight. Now, when it comes to performance, when this phone first came out, it definitely was no slouch. It was faster than the A17 Pro in the 15 Pro Max in terms of CPU and GPU. Though of course, it wasn't some huge generational leap, there definitely was a decent improvement. But the 16 Pro Max actually brought something more important than raw performance. It was actually when it came to thermals and heat management. Now, the 16 Pro Max still did heat up somewhat, but definitely in terms of performance, it was a lot more stable and stayed a lot cooler compared to the 15 Pro Max. And that was the most important thing when it came to performance. It wasn't just about having the highest numbers for that single benchmark or for the first 15 minutes, but this phone could actually go for longer periods of time before heating up, throttling down, and lowering display brightness. And yeah, performance still definitely holds up really, really well, all things considered. Whether you're gaming, editing, or doing any task, the 16 Pro Max is definitely going to be capable of handling it. Now, when it comes to the cameras, the iPhone 16 Pro Max still remains one of the best out there. Though, on paper, it might not look like that much has changed. As the main cam, telephoto, and selfie still remain mostly the same, the biggest change that came with this phone was actually the 48 megapixel ultra-wide cam. Coming from 12 megapixels, this was a big upgrade when it came to image quality, or at least I thought. Because when I first got this phone, out of the box, I used the ultra-wide and honestly, the quality looked almost the same as it did on the 15 Pro Max. And the only time I actually noticed a visible difference was when I would turn on 48 megapixel RAW, which would really use that whole sensor, but of course came with the downside of taking pictures slower and processing them slower, and of course using more storage as well. When it comes to day-to-day use, I don't actually think it impacts the camera experience overall as much as the new software tuning did. Because one thing I did notice with the photos from the 16 Pro Max is they just looked a little bit more refined compared to those on the 15 Pro Max. And this didn't apply to just photos only, but videos as well. Though if you had to guess which video or picture came from the 16 Pro Max or 15 Pro Max without seeing them both side by side, you probably wouldn't notice the biggest difference. But if you're definitely into maximizing every single megapixel and feature that your phone has when it comes to camera, the 16 Pro Max definitely isn't a letdown. With all its features, from ProRes video to huge 48 megapixel RAW photos, this phone definitely won't disappoint. Now, this is where things actually get interesting because Apple promised that the 16 Pro Max would have better battery life, and that was obviously due to having a physically larger battery inside and a more efficient chip. And in my experience, after using the phone for more than a year, yes, it actually did have better battery life, and it was noticeable. It wasn't just a few minutes more. I would sometimes get a few hours more depending on usage compared to my 15 Pro Max. But the most surprising thing actually with this phone is that compared to the 15 Pro Max that came before and even the 14 Pro Max, battery health was a lot better with the 16 Pro Max. And of course, when it comes to charging as well, charging remains relatively unchanged, except this phone now supports faster MagSafe charging at up to 25 watts with the newer MagSafe charging pucks. But when it comes to wired, it remains relatively about the same, hovering around 25 to 30 watts. So yeah, battery life definitely was a really good improvement, and not just battery life, but battery health and degradation as well. The microphones and speakers, at least in my experience, remained almost unchanged, but that necessarily isn't a bad thing because the mics and speakers on the 15 Pro Max were already top tier, and the 16 Pro Max still remains the same, having great speakers and mics for anything audio related. Now, talking about software, whenever a new iPhone comes out, there's bound to be a few bugs and glitches, and definitely I did experience quite a few when the phone first came out, from randomly overheating to random stutters and freezes in apps and the overall smoothness of the software. But of course, as time went on, Apple ironed these all out. And even now, on the latest version of iOS, performance and smoothness overall when it comes to software remains great. And of course, it wouldn't be software without talking a little bit about Apple Intelligence. So of course, when this phone first came out, they practically marketed Apple Intelligence as its biggest and most promising feature. And I think based on where it is now, we can kind of see that it really wasn't the biggest thing to come with this phone. And yes, even though Apple Intelligence isn't really what it lived up to be, or at least what we expected it to be, knowing this phone was specifically built to handle Apple Intelligence is reassuring because when it eventually gets better, this phone will be able to handle it really well and smoothly. Now, when it comes to longevity, this phone definitely isn't going anywhere for a really long time. I mean, it's barely even a year old at this point. And Apple has a really good track record for keeping their phones updated, so this phone should definitely see at least 5 to 6 more years of major OS and security updates. So the iPhone 16 Pro Max represents the peak of this design. And not just that, but also the end of an era. Perfected titanium, rounded edges, and an overall premium and luxurious design. But yes, technically, the iPhone Air does pass the torch this phone once had. I definitely wouldn't call it a pro iPhone. As though the iPhone Air is great, it definitely lacks and cuts a few corners to get to where it's trying to be. And based on the trend of where we're going right now, as we've seen with the 17 Pro series, Apple definitely won't make another phone like this again anytime soon. So in late 2025, moving into 2026, is the iPhone 16 Pro Max actually worth buying still? The answer is yes, absolutely, especially if you're someone who really values this design philosophy. So this is the iPhone 16 Pro Max, the last truly premium iPhone. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time.